Let's talk about evolution. As any Pokemon master would know, Charmander evolves into Charmeleon at level 16, and Charmeleon evolves into Charizard at level 36, and unfortunately, that kind of evolution isn't actually real. So I guess we'll have to talk about the slightly more complicated topic of natural selection. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding and misconception around evolution by natural selection, and hopefully this video can help to alleviate that. First, we need to define what we're talking about. In the context of this video, we're going to say evolution is a change in allele frequency over time. Technically, an allele is defined as a particular version of a gene, but for the purpose of this video, it's just a particular characteristic that an organism may have. The frequency of an allele is just how many of the organisms in a population have that allele. In order to visualize how this works, let's look at this population of horseshoe blobs. The first of Darwin's postulates is that there's variation within a population. In this population of 32 blobs, 23 are blue, 6 are green, 2 are red, and 1 is dark blue. The second postulate is that some of the variation is heritable. In this model, let's keep it simple and say that a blob reproduces by simply creating a perfect copy of itself. This way, the population doubles in each reproductive cycle. The third postulate states that more offspring are produced than what the environment can support. This could mean food limitations, space limitations, or in our case, a predator. The yellow blobtopus is a pretty simple predator that just picks out its prey by sight. It doesn't really care what kind of blob it eats because it finds them all delicious. To satisfy the final postulate, variations have to affect the ability of a blob to survive and reproduce. In our case, blue blobs are the norm. Green blobs have a camouflage advantage, while the red and dark blue blobs have a camouflage disadvantage. Fitness in this context just means the ability of an organism to survive and reproduce. So in our population of blobs, you might say that variants with different alleles may have different fitness in this environment. Let's follow our blob population to the next reproductive cycle and see what happens. The predator is eating blobs of all sorts, but has particular preference for the red and dark blue blobs since they are easier for it to spot. It does eat some green blobs, but they are harder to focus on, so it prefers to go for blobs that are easier to see. By the start of the next reproductive cycle, there are no dark blue blobs left and no red blobs left. The predator has one last meal, and now a new reproductive cycle starts and the horseshoe blobs are ready to reproduce again. Before they reproduce, let's count them and compare to the original population of 32. There are again 32 blobs in this population, and still 23 of them are blue, but now the number of green blobs has increased to 9, while the red and dark blue blobs have disappeared. So what does that tell us? First, we can see that the dark blue blobs and the red blobs have relatively poor fitness. But we can also see that the number of green blobs increased and the blue blobs stayed the same, so green blobs must have better fitness than blue blobs. We can then say that the red allele and the dark blue allele were selected against, while the green allele was selected for. So what did we see? Allele frequency in the population changed over time. This population of blobs has evolved. In the real world, there are many more factors to consider, and there may be thousands of alleles, but natural selection still works in basically the same way. More fit allele combinations become more common, and less fit allele combinations become less common or disappear. In the real world, though, natural selection usually takes a long time. It's not as fast as what we just saw. Now we might ask, what if the original assumptions and conditions we had set had been different? Even in the simple model, there are lots of things we can change, like, for example, the color of the background. Now the green blobs have a disadvantage and the red blobs have an advantage. Obviously this would change the selective pressure in favor of the red blobs. We could introduce a different predator. For example, the blue blobtocross has a preference for blue blobs because they have an essential blue nutrient that it needs. On the other hand, the giant roundablob discriminates based on size because it figures the smaller blobs just aren't worth its while. Again, changing the characteristics of the predator would affect the evolution of the horseshoe blob population. Maybe the dark blue blobs can reproduce more quickly. If dark blue blobs triple when they reproduce, in only 2 generations the dark blue blobs have reproduced more than twice as much as the normal blue blobs. This kind of thing can also affect the success of different blobs. So clearly, changing the conditions can have a big effect on the evolution of the species. In the real world, things are always changing. It's not instantaneous, but it means that species have to change in order to deal with the changing conditions. Some populations don't have any variants that can survive the change, and they go extinct. We hear about that a lot with climate. Climatic changes can include temperature and precipitation changes, and in the Ice Ages, for example, many species that could not cope with the changing climate became extinct. Oxygen in the air can also be important. Insects need lots of oxygen in the air in order to grow large. When oxygen levels were higher, some insects became incredibly large, but they all were selected against when oxygen levels dropped. These are only a few examples of environmental factors which may affect the fitness of an allele. At this point, you may have some questions. You may have noticed that natural selection always produces less variation than before, and it can only make alleles extinct, not create new ones. Where do the different alleles come from? Further, I mentioned that an allele is actually a version of a gene. How does genetics tie into all of this? Answers to both of those questions lie in mutation, but that will be addressed in a separate video. Thanks for watching! If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for new videos, feel free to leave them in the comments section below. Naturally, you should select the subscribe button as well.